Archivist!
Alright. Let's get down to the meat and potatoes. So, Karl Student, just to give you a background, before he was the Oberst General, I don't know how you pronounce that, but basically a Major General, Fallschirmjäger in the Luftwaffe. He was actually a pilot during World War I, actually scored 6 kills, 4 directly air-to-air. A pioneer of airborne operations, headmaster of airborne schools during the interwar years, and this is the peculiar part. This guy, as per stipulations with the Geneva Convention, the German army could not have an air force, and so they had to use gliders, and they had to secretly use bases within the Soviet Union to train airborne operations. Is very, very interesting. So he was actually held to a high degree of trust. Very interesting guy. But here's his, claim to fame is actually at Eben Amel in the early days of World War II. Germany was doing its battle for France, and Belgium, of course, they invaded through Belgium. And the Belgians actually had created this massive fortress staffed by, 1,000 standing army guys. It was a major thorn in the side of the operation to head towards the lowlands. So Karl Student actually managed to convince Hitler of this daring operation, and Hitler was a huge fan of, very Nietzschean, high risk, high reward with like a lot of elan type of martial spirit, and this was precisely what he did. Long story short, he deployed over this fortress with very limited casualties on both sides, captured the entire garrison, captured their equipment, their heavy howitzers as well. There are 2 of them, which were actually retrofitted and fitted into the later into the defense line when the Allied forces invaded into Europe. Very important. But this is where Hitler came to understand the necessity and the big advantages of having airborne troops. And mind you, airborne troops, this kind of idea of deploying from the air, was a brand new concept. It was never tried before. Aviation was just starting. The planes also were quickly evolving. For instance, the Soviet paratroopers, instead of flying off during the 1920s, there are some awesome videos. I will link it in the description. But there are some awesome videos of the Soviet paratroopers who would take these transport planes, and they would first of all have to walk out on these wings and then slide off these wings, which is absolutely insane. The Germans refined this process and actually started doing out of the Junkers 52, they would jump out of the cabin from the back, and so optimizing the way that paratroopers would deploy. Very interesting guy. However, so fast forward to 1940, 1941, Germany is at odds with Britain. Britain obviously has a naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. The USSR is being prepared for invasion. The hour is late. Resources are trim, and the balance of power is quickly shifting in the favor of the Allies. Now, how does one take Crete? This is the moment where Karl Student comes and lobbies again for a very daring mission, Operation Mercury. This is the point in which he tells and he had to fight for it. He had to go through, Göring. He had to talk to, the army guys and get their assent, and the freaking Wehrmacht, was a pain in the ass. These old Junker types that didn't like the innovation, these fundamentally conservative in the small c sense, these people that were just kind of, I myself, I'm sure I am a big fan of, the right and stuff like that, but I can't stand these people that can only think in one stodifying, fossilized way. And there are many good things about the Junker class, but I've got to say, them overlooking Kurtstudent is one of their biggest mistakes, amongst other things. However, I would say this, to bring it full circle, he actually broached the subject to Hitler and said, hey, listen, you know how we took that fortress back in Belgium? Why don't we do that, but bigger, in Crete? And guess what? It's not going to cost you any naval units, or not many. It's not going to cost you many forces, and guess what? You're going to be able to secure the Eastern Mediterranean in your favor against the Allies, and thus securing any air raids into your oil fields. And Hitler was like, damn, that sounds fucking awesome. These guys are going to be jumping from the sky? And Kurt was like, oh yeah. And he's like, oh, fuck yeah. So they fucking did it. And so, anyway, he started planning, and ultimately, the plan was starting to coalesce, and this is the first time that the Fallschirmjäger were actually employed in a mass assault without ground supporting troops, without the necessary forward training operations. So the operations before, they had jumped into Denmark, they had jumped into Norway, they had jumped into Belgium before, so they have a lot of experience, they have a lot of training, but they never had a not supporting element on the ground. So, for instance, in Denmark, the Wehrmacht and the Panzer units were quickly taking different pieces of territory, etc. So when a Fallschirmjäger would jump down, guess what? Not very long, there would be supporting units helping them side by side. But in Crete, it was necessary for the Fallschirmjäger to succeed as per this plan, or the whole thing would fail. Now, the Fallschirmjäger wouldn't have to necessarily win in the other operations they had done. They would just be shock troops. They would disorient the enemy, prevent him from digging in and putting substantial defensive positions in, and then basically the blitz would happen. So they were only a prelude, they weren't the main effort. Now, let's go back and talk about Crete. And so the distinction the British, or the Dominion forces, had labeled Crete under was Crayforce, specifically under the command of the New Zealander Major General Bernard Freyberg. And if you can bear with me for 1 second, let me harken back to this book, Crete, 1941. There is this great description of this man. 1 second. Okay, this is Antony Beevor now, and I'm going to read you some background so you can understand his psyche. Okay, Antony Beevor now. During the interwar years, Freyberg settled down. He married a remarkable woman, both well-connected and greatly liked, and left behind the ostentatious bravery of his youth, when his ambition to win medals had been ingenuously proclaimed. He retired from the army in 1934. 5 years later, on the outbreak of war, Churchill lobbied on his behalf when the future command of the New Zealand's expeditionary force was discussed. But Churchill's intervention made a little difference to the deliberations. The New Zealand forces at that time had no obvious candidate. In the early days, Freyberg was not popular, especially with his staff officers. He had acquired the formalism of the British Army of the time and lost touch with the New Zealand of his youth. To the irritation of his officers, he busied himself with details which should have left to them. But as the war progressed, they grew to admire his strengths. On top of his bravery, he had a genuine interest in the welfare of his men, and he was a first-class trainer of troops, and they had developed a humorous, although occasionally exasperated, affection for his weaknesses. So, side note, one good thing. So don't, as a leader, micromanage motherfuckers, okay? That's the other thing that people really don't understand. It is not a good leadership trait for you to get in people's fucking shit and micromanage the fuck out of them. That's exactly what this guy sounds like. He's micromanaging you. Nothing is perfect. He's fastidious. It's one of these kind of characteristics that don't make a good leader. A leader delegates. He does not do. Not necessarily. Like, for instance, Patton, great leader. So was Rommel, and they both never were on the ground, you know, up in the gun crew shit, doing things for them. That would never happen. He always delegated. Now, continuing on. These failings, chiefly obstinacy, muddled thinking, and an extreme reluctance to criticize subordinates. So, here again, stubborn, not very smart. Smart is the wrong word, because in this aspect, he's probably a very intelligent man. I would say it has something to do with the authoritarian personality. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, in a military setting, you need an authoritarian personality to lead. You need to have the ability to be what they call a bigot. You have to have form, give form, the Apollonian vice the Dionysian. However, people that have a too strong on this level, too much zest, unfortunately, they can get in the way of their own planning. It could be there's too many conflicting information and topics, and you will see later where, for instance, he's given dispatches from Ultra, which was this top secret surveillance program that the British had actually cracked the German Enigma code way beforehand, given him top secret sensitive communiques, saying specifically, hey man, the Germans, you know, they're not going to invade by sea. There's going to be no like sea invasion at all. It's mostly going to be from the air. And he was the only one that was allowed to see this, him and his XO. And guess what the motherfucker did? Well, I'll tell you in a second. Anyway, continuing. Became especially important in the circumstances of Crete. Freyberg was famous for his inability to sack a useless officer. Even after promising his staff that he would go through with it, he could not bear to be unkind. One of them wrote later. Another problem, man. Listen, in the times of warfare, where the currency of combat comes in the people's lives, comes in your men's lives, what might seem like kindness is killing people. Having an incompetent officer kills men. It's unacceptable. Continuing on. So he could not bear to be unkind, blah, 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 blah. This was perhaps that of yeah, gay, alright. Bernard Freyberg was indeed large, and the description barrel-chested for once fitted it perfectly. Churchill called him the great Saint Bernard, which suggests also his rather endearing schoolboyish enthusiasms. When he wore his lemon squeezer hat, he really did look like a huge scoutmaster, as another of his staff officers remarked. Freyberg provides yet another example of how storybook heroes seldom make good generals. A member of the War Cabinet staff felt that Churchill was too impressed by men of action. Winston was a bad judge of character. He didn't seem able to relate to the task to the man needed to do it. He automatically went for men who had been tremendous fire-eaters in their youth, almost thinking, who is most like I was then. So remember that Churchill, you know, as much as he's the one that, the main perpetrator, the guy that fucking ruined Western civilization, that destroyed the British Empire, that was a morphine addict, drunkard piece of shit, in his youth he was actually a good soldier. He served in South Africa and the British colonies there and fought, and he was tremendously brave. But the thing, he was like a Chad, you know what I mean? He was a meat eater, you know, and in many ways, this is one of the issues, is that there are many different levels of command. And the Germans had this perfect plan of assigning different officers. For instance, if you're a young officer, you don't have to go, you know, start from lieutenant to captain to all the way to the top just to get to general, so that way you could do general things. They would scope out these officers from the beginning and be like, okay, this guy would suck as a platoon commander in the infantry or the combat arms, etc. But you know what? He's really fucking smart. Let's put him on planning. Let's put him at the top, right? Let's let him skip these things. You know, maybe he's not going to be a general someday, but let's use his general's talents to our benefit. But in the British and American model, that's not the case. You have to go up through the ranks, and guess what? As you go up, the people that get hired are the ones that do well in the lowest levels of organization, so the platoon, company, battalion level. And ultimately, in that arena, the selecting pressures for officers that get promoted and do well on that tier are usually the people that may or may not be good generals, but it certainly narrows the pool of great thinkers once you get to a general level in strategic thinking, etc. Now, continuing on. As I had said previously in the first episode, the British force there, which was comprised of New Zealanders, Australians, and the British main forces, had lost a lot of their equipment, especially heavy equipment. Anti-air and anti-tank guns were lost. The tank equipment logistical units had suffered tremendously. Additionally, the British were demoralized. They had just suffered through a losing campaign in Greece, experienced the Germans at their best, and they had their ass handed to them, and they were kicked out of Greece when they were getting their nose held out in front of them and then kicking them in the ass. It was actually a pretty piss poor sight. However, they were rallied and they were digging in trenches, and ultimately they were following their senior leaders. However, the New Zealanders and Australians had this very poor, they're very wild. They were not used to the formal discipline. They weren't very disciplined professional units. However, they were good fighting units, or good enough, comparably. They were not disciplined units, and often would disrespect officers and have a lot of trouble with fraternization, acquiescing to orders that were necessary or that they deemed unnecessary. They would not do so, etc. A lot of problems with that. But the general disposition of troops was negative. However, the British had, again, the Navy on their side. They had superior intel. As I said, the ultra intel communiques to General Freyberg should have given him the edge. It should have been able to give him the understanding of how the disposition of the German attack would occur. And he did plan on how it would land. Anyway, let me tell you in a second. So, on the German side, the Luftwaffe had amassed a significant portion of the Luftwaffe, fighters and bombers, etc., to this operation, and they harried the shit out of this island. I mean, truly, the British forces would be so scared. They would hide in the olive groves, and they would not get sleep at night. It was day in, day out, raids after raids after raids, and it instilled in them almost like a Pavlovian effect of any air sirens would cause them to drop all their shit immediately, like it was a task, and not even look up, just go into their trenches without, scoping out and being situationally aware. Now, Operation Mercury was centered on 3 airfields on this Cretian island. And you have to imagine this island, if you can pull it up. I'll put it on the description as well. But there are 3 major airstrips situated next to significant towns on this island. On this island it was Meleme, Heraklion, and Racimno. And at these 3 areas, it was on the northern side of the island, which is a long peninsula. It's almost like a long hot dog, right? Except for the shallow end, so Suda Bay and all that stuff. That's all on the northern side, favoring the Germans for a seaborne invasion. And guess what? On the southern side, it's a massive bluff set of cliffs, which is inaccessible to naval invasion, which is another reason why the Allies did not want to cede Crete to the Germans, because it would just be a massive bunker in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, checking the Allies in Cyprus and in North Africa. Again, the Axis had the 7th Flieger Division, which is the 1st Airborne Division. This 22nd Air Landing Division is a glider division, which is significant portion. And the reason why they had these glider divisions, namely, was because of the fact that if you go back to the interwar years, the Germans couldn't use turbine engine planes, and so they had to get creative. And one of the creations of specifically Crete is playing around with this concept of glider units, which are used to great effect. And then the 5th Elite Mountain Division, very cool. These guys would go into battle and they would have their own Edelweiss flower on their lapel to show that they were great, first of all, mountaineer and a warrior. Very, very cool. On the Allied side, they had the New Zealand forces, 21st, 22nd, 23rd divisions. I'm not gonna name you all these freaking brigades and divisions, etc. But suffice it to say that they're lightly armed infantry units, and at each of these airfields, the British had just enough to supply each local commander with 2 tanks in reserve. Okay, but these tanks in reserve, they were not well kept up, right? They were all old Cromwells, and the British tanks sucked, by the way. During World War II, they had a terrible design flaws. I mean, it was just freaking awful. And additionally, they were aided by Greek irregulars who buffered and buttressed the Allied forces as well. They made up for, and also the added phenomenon of franc tireurs. So regular civilians like priests, monks, and shit, they would go out in battle and fucking kill these guys. It was actually pretty impressive. Which reminds me, I need to go take care of some insurgents myself right now. Sergeant Barnes, put on that track. Thank you. Alright. So we are on the precipice of the invasion. The Germans have planned everything down to the T, and at that moment everyone's, except for Crete, who by the way is resolute in the ability of his men to succeed. Everyone else is talking shit, the Junker's talking shit. Hitler has high hopes, but he doesn't know, he's kind of like, he's on the side. He already portended the fact that there would be high casualties in this battle, and how true would that foresight be? Honestly, I gotta think to myself, you know, Hitler is going to be remembered like Napoleon. People shit on Hitler because there's this like stupid, you know, the whole deal with the tribe and fucking hating on Hitler and everything he did was terrible and whatever. What a bunch of bullshit. But the thing is, you know, the war would have ended a lot worse and ended a lot sooner had it not been for his cause. Very prescient mind, military mind specifically. In any case, so they all ready to go. The first wave of Germans are mobilized. 20th May 1940. And they're about to put the fear of the Germanic gods in those Zionists. Let me remind you, before the battle, what you do is prep the battlefield. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, aerial bombardments by the Luftwaffe. And many sorties, etc. And like I told you earlier, these men that were taking, you know, fire every day, day in, day out, sorties 2-3 times a day, destroying things. They, you know, it's all fucked. Imagine you're digging one moment all day in the hot sun with no water, and suddenly you hear the dreadful sound of the Stuka bomber fucking attacking your shit, killing your men, and so you're already used to getting fucked with, and so when the air sirens go off, all you do is duck for cover. That's what I was talking about earlier. But this time, well, the Boche had a different plan, and let me read to you what they felt at that moment of the invasion. Again, this is Antony Beevor, Crete, 1941. This is him now. While the action against the glider troops was beginning on top of the hill, which they had already landed, silently of course, above the Crayforce quarry, Freyberg's staff officers observed the panoramic view over the coastal plain with a mixture of astonishment, dread, and professional fascination. These Britoids, man, gotta tell you. The air fleet approached over the sea, and the heavens shook with the roar of their engines. When they first saw the stream of black shapes coming out behind the troop carriers, several observers thought for a moment that the aircraft were trailing smoke after being hit, but the shapes separated and sprouted canopies with a jerk, white for paratroopers and red, green, or yellow for weapon canisters, equipment, or supplies. Oh, David Hunt, standing next to Group Captain Beamish, heard him murmur, "What a remarkable sight! Looks like the end of the world." Oh, man, I wish I had been there to see that. Imagine a whole bunch of steel-clad modern Valkyries gliding across the sky, slowly, loudly at you, and then softly jumping down from the heavens to give you sweet death. Man, that's got to be some balls on those guys. I can't imagine what it must have felt like to be the helpless Britoids just sitting on that rock looking at these guys come at you. I mean, you've got to have balls. First of all, to jump out of a fucking plane. Second of all, hit the ground and have the wherewithal and aggression to take the fight to the enemy. To have the self-awareness and spatial recognition of your location to get to your starting lines. And it's so amazing. This is one of my favorite freaking operations. I apologize if I girl out on you a little bit here. Definitely a big fan of Kirchstedon. One second. And so the, as I had said before, the glider troops attacked first, and this is all the same throughout the three different airstrips: Malema, Heraklion, and Visarthru. I don't know how to pronounce the last one of these fucking Greek-Lord names. In any case, they drop to their positions. They're fighting already. These soldiers are already parachuting from the planes. They come down to their starting positions, the starting line, and the way that the paratroop harness is on these Fallschirmjäger, it's not like the Americans where it's shoulder strapped. Instead, it's from the nape of the neck. So these guys are falling down almost as though they're being perched up like kittens and held by the scruff of their neck. And so it doesn't give you a lot of mobility. You can't shoot back at these guys from the air at people shooting at you, which is what the Americans and the British could do with their harnesses, and they often did. Additionally, these guys, and so their helplessness, they would land in the olive groves between the rows, and some of them would get caught, and they were left totally helpless. They could not direct. There's no modern paragliding where you can, land in whatever field you want. No, you're landing wherever the fuck that shit lands you, and you better hope you land in the right spot, because it's not just the enemy troops that are shooting at you. Guess what? It's the fucking monks. I'm not even lying to you. Hold on. Let me tell you this real second. 1 second. And this is Antony Beevor again. Crete's greatest difference to the horror of the Germans was the part played by unrecruited civilians, in quotations, right? The Cretan resistance, unlike those underground movements in the rest of Europe, which did not start up to develop until a year or so after the German occupation, began literally in the first hour of the invasion. Boys, old men, and also women displayed a breathtaking bravery in defense of their island. German soldiers were doubly scandalized at the idea of women fighting them. I don't think so. I think everyone knows who fights and who doesn't, especially, that's such bullshit. I hate these fucking stupid neoliberal writings. Anyway, they ripped the dress from the shoulder of a suspect. If she had a bruise from the recoil of a rifle or was caught knife in hand, she would be shot along with the men. Well, that's feminine for you. Fucking deal with it. Scattered paratroopers landing near Perovilia were, in the words of the New Zealand official history, dispatched by civilians with axes and spades, motherfuckers would come out with axes and spades and clobber your ass to death. Yeah. One of the first examples of spontaneous mobilization was an attack on the rear of the Parachute Engineer Battalion, which had landed round Lake Aia by Cretan irregulars advancing from the large village of Alikinau. Oh my god. Within a short space of time, according to a German report, the 16th Company of the Storm Regiment, which had been ordered to protect the south of the aerodrome, which is the airstrip of Malema, continually had to fight against Frank Tireurs, whatever. Although the Cretans had their own proud traditions of resistance to the Turk, their ferocity and reckless bravery in 1941 were more reminiscent of the 2nd of May rising against Napoleon's forces in Madrid, of a guerra al cuchillo, war to the knife. Metal, dude. These guys, they already have my respect. When motherfuckers start fighting like that, I respect the Greeks. Much respect. And listen to this, the best. Some priests led their parishioners into battle. Father Stylianos Fratsekis. Damn, what a different name. Please, Greekoloid friends, forgive. Hearing of the airborne invasion, rushed to the church to sound the bell. Taking a rifle, he marched his volunteers north from his town and later fought German motorcycle detachments, when they reached Candanos. An intelligence officer from the 14th Infantry Brigade headquarters remembered several priests, keen duck shooters, and therefore pretty good shots, who almost certainly took part in the fighting. At the time of the battle, one went round with a rifle down his trousers, waiting for the chance of a pot shot at German paratroopers. Man, that's really impressive. Honestly, I mean, people say that's scandalizing or whatever. No. I respect people that fight for their country. And I have every bit of respect for a martial culture like that. The aggression and the lack of excuses to defend your own country. That is awesome. I think out of everyone on that battlefield that day, the people that took the glory were obviously the Germans and these Greek regulars. I mean, I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed. But moving on. At the end of the first day, it was a crazy exchange. From the morning till dusk, they fought. They were isolated. And the Germans, when they would parachute down, they didn't have their main Mausers with them. They didn't have their SMGs with them. That was in the weapons canisters, right? So they were only parachuted down with their pistols, which is unfortunate because sometimes they would be scattered. Sometimes the pilots would fly too far, too fast, and so they couldn't make contact with the rest of their stick, rest of their platoon, or company. And this happened into the night. And there are stories of German paratroopers trying to make their way through the darkness, coming across one or two other Allied troopers, you know, just walking to their lines, and they had this secret, almost unpronounced understanding of, hey, don't shoot me, I won't shoot you, we'll just walk away, Mexican standoff style. But the first battle took a lot of casualties. The Germans couldn't secure any of the airstrips. The Allied resistance was very strong, and they took 1,800 casualties, KIA, first day, boom. And many of their men, specifically, there are many officers that bit the dust, and two, which I respect a lot, there are men from the Free Corps had jumped down. In fact, you know what? No. I'm going to find this guy's name. This guy's fucking impressive. 1 second. Here he is. Heinrich Crete, also called the Butcher of Crete. How savage is that? No, this guy jumped with a monocle fixed to his face down into combat, and it was said it didn't fall out of his face. Did I tell you that? How impressive is that? Very impressive. But, any case, a lot of people died the first day, and this is what Hitler had portended. And in this time, this crucial moment, which is the arc of this episode, so pay attention. This is where leadership matters. Freiburg was indecisive, and his men weren't given the latitude to act decisively. In fact, even Colonel Andrews, many of the men under him, people that he did not relieve, exhibited the same overly cautious nature, and in war, aggression, tempo, well, that is to say, a high operational tempo is what wins the day. And he lost the initiative. So this first day was a catastrophe. By all means, the Wehrmacht, or excuse me, the Luftwaffe should have lost. All his men should have lost. But guess what? Who didn't order a strong counterattack that day? Who didn't get their shit together? Freiburg and his subordinate commanders. And he would pay dearly for it. So the next day, more waves go in, and people are becoming to, in the OKH and the OKW, are feeling insecure. They're thinking that we should call off this gamble. But this is the mistake. Once you have attacked, you got to go all in. There's no half measures. Once you have attacked, once you pull the trigger, you got to follow through. In fact, this is a maxim as old as Napoleon Bonaparte's maxim of war. And if you don't mind, I'll read it to you right now. Remember, this is Napoleon now. At the commencement of a campaign, to advance or not to advance is a matter for grave consideration. But when once the offensive has been assumed, it must be sustained to the last extremity. However skillful the maneuvers in a retreat, it will always weaken the morale of an army, because in losing the chances of success, these last are transferred to the enemy. Besides, retreats always cost more men and materiel than the most bloody engagements, with this difference, that in a battle with the enemy's loss is nearly equal to your own, whereas in a retreat, the loss is on your side only. And remember, there is no retreat. There is no going across the ocean. That's it. When he's going to call it off and leave his men there? Ludicrous. Napoleon also said this: when you have resolved to fight a battle, collect your whole force. Your whole force. Dispense with nothing. A single battalion sometimes decides the day. And how true was it for Kurtstudent? And he knew it. And there was a lot of intrigue and shit going on in the OKH, and they were trying to cut his heels, and he had to do some of these politicking moves that happens, petty politics between officers. God, I hate that thing. But he had to kind of abscond some communiques. Goering was very concerned with the way that the combat was being waged, and ultimately he just went all in. He went all in with all his poker chips. And the second day arose. So they fought through the night, and the next wave of the paratroopers and glider troops went in. And finally, there's a break at Malema, and they seize the airstrip on the second day, towards the end. And this is perfect, because suddenly Kurtstudent, he gets the freaking call, and he's like, alright, perfect, let me send my crack troop of my mountain division in. And they were airlifted onto the airstrip while it was still hot. The Fallschirmjäger divisions were still fighting on the airstrip, on the outskirts of the airstrip. They were clearing the wreckage of planes that had been shot down, shot on the tarmac, shot trying to land, take off, etc. Things were smoldering. It was insane, a chaotic experience, and yet they had the energy and the discipline and the aggression to clear the runway, to get the men on the ground, an entire division's worth, and seize the city. And it was all over from that. And here's the thing, in between that night, between the 20th and the 21st, the king of Greece actually was on Crete. And may the gods damn him to the seventh hell, because I hate this man. Instead of standing and fighting with his people, monks and priests and women were fighting in his stead. And guess what he did? He scurried away. He let the British tell the Greek king to abandon his land. How disgusting is that? I want to go back to a time where our sovereigns actually take the field of battle and they fight. Obviously not every battle, but I mean, if your country is about to get completely invaded and occupied, and this is the last redoubt, I think your presence would do well on the battlefield. It's just like that Chadian president that died just this year. Very Chad indeed. It's very unfortunate that he passed away, but I know he walks in the field of Elysium. Even though he's a Swarthoid, I like this guy. He's pretty damn cool. Next to General Buttnaked, of course. But that's neither here nor there. As I was saying, Freyberg continues to be indecisive. Nothing changes. His commanders also are overly cautious. The tanks malfunction. Their armament is only armor-piercing, so it doesn't really change anything, it just has a psychological factor, and they were ill-piloted. So, there are many issues here, and we're going to go back to it in the analysis in the final segment, but hear me out. And so ultimately, ammunition runs out for the Allies. The Germans have the initiative. They take the aggression, and they're taking the fight to the enemy. Ultimately, the British are on a firmly defensive mood, firmly defensive posture. Only select units and commanders are actually making forays and counterattacks. But these forays and counterattacks are weak and not wholehearted bayonet charges. And here's the thing. In a paratrooper repulse, you need to get in there. As soon as they fucking land, in fact, even before they land, first of all, you gotta be shooting them. And when they land, when they're trying to get their harness off, that's when you go there and you stab a motherfucker through the neck. Not just sitting on your fucking thumb, waiting in your entrenched positions, waiting for them to get their crew guns up and running, for them to run to their canisters, get their cohesion back together, their organizations back together, orders to be laid out, for them to get to their starting line. See, they have to run through 3 or 4 or 5 different processes before they can orient themselves for the battle. You already have the initiative as the defending force, and they're fucking up. So anyway, continuing. They ultimately take all the battlefields, all the airstrips. Malema is taken first, and then they clear the countryside, and they're given aid to Heraklion, and finally the last town on the end. And in this secretive moment, Pendlebury, the guy that was in charge of the Stay Behind organization, the guy that's supposed to organize the Cretan Greek guerrilla forces after the German occupation, was found out. He was wearing civilian clothes, and he was summarily shot. People, Antony Beevor tries to make it sound like it's ridiculous. Oh my God, how dare he shoot an officer? It's like, well, this guy was in civilian clothes in the middle of a battlefield, and the Germans, even he admits, were meticulously always observing the Geneva Conventions. And what do you expect? This guy's a fucking spy. You're going to shoot him. It's so frustrating. But I mean, Pendlebury himself was actually a very cool man. I myself like history and archaeology, etc. But ultimately, it's a total rout. Freyberg is dislodged from Crete, and they all try to escape, and ultimately are encircled and entrapped. And the Axis take over 15,000, I think it was 20,000, which is the upper limit, prisoners. All the while sustaining 2,500 casualties, mostly 2,000 KIA. It's a resounding success. Massive casualties were incurred on the German side. However, it was a strategic win for the Wehrmacht and the Axis powers, and stabilized the Mediterranean, giving them a more secure position to protect the oil, like I said, and sustain operations in Operation Barbarossa. Now, moving on to the analysis. Here is the overarching theme. Leadership is key. The British forces are not ill-trained. By circumstances, they didn't have heavy weapons as much as the Germans did, but the Germans also didn't have that kind of heavy weaponry. You know, they had to have parachuted in tools and ammunition, and their field guns are smaller than a regular, you know, army's howitzer. And so I would say that they're on equal levels, and especially because of the fact that the defensive posture of the British forces on Crete were superior to any attack. I mean, they were on an island. They had superior intel. They had naval guns that could have given them supporting fire, which is another thing. They couldn't get communications up to their supporting elements. And they were indecisive, passive, slow to react. This is exactly the opposite of the kind of leadership that you need in battle, especially when modern warfare relies on, again, aggression, quickness of thought, and ruthless action. Ruthless. It has to be ruthless. War is not a fucking playground. Something that people don't understand. It's not chivalry. You're not knights in a tournament. This is not a fairy tale. And guess what? It's all very nice and well to read about this in the history books from the safety of our own rooms, reminiscing about past battles and the romanticism of all this. But the reality is, people died. And on the British side, guess what? It was because of General Freyberg that his men were killed or captured. And he lost because of a failure of leadership. And vice versa, Kurt took the day, won the day, because of his superior leadership. Leadership is the difference. It's the key. No matter what you have in your hands, no matter what kind of odds you face, I promise you, willpower and good leadership surmount it all. And in the coming podcast, you too will be a believer. But that's all I have for you today. And I hope that you actually do read these books. Again, I cited a lot from Antony Beevor, Crete 1941, but I also used as personal reference Operation Mercury by Stackpole Military History Series. Very good series. I'm going to ask you guys whether or not you want more detail or less detail. I kind of wanted to have a cursory talk about the campaigns, and mostly how the campaigns reflect onto small unit leadership skills, what you should focus on, and why it's very important. But that's it for today. And for this week's task, I have just one movie for you. I want you to watch Mr. Jones. It's a movie about intrigue and discovery of the Holodomor. Came out in 2017, and of course, a certain party doesn't want it to be proselytized to the general public, but it's a art festival film. I recommend it. And secondarily, if you guys wouldn't mind subscribing, I use all that money for reference material for my podcast to give you and educate our men to our firm of victory. But that's all I have for you today. This is Lance's Legion, signing off.